Professor Müller, the next topic which I'd like to discuss with you is this question of the newly implemented German minimum wage. When was the minimum wage introduced in Germany and why?
One has to distinguish we had a sectoral minimum wage in several branches of the economy, and the first minimum wage was introduced in 1997 in the German construction sector. Relatively high minimum wage at that time, different levels in East and West Germany. And by the way, we examined the impact of the minimum wage, and we found out that there was no effect on employment in the West, but there were some hints of negative effects in the East, because in the East the level of the minimum wage relative to the median wage, the mean wage, was relatively high. And so other branches introduced minimum wages as well. But in 2015, on the 1st of January, general minimum wage, a statutory minimum wage, was introduced of €8.50, with some, but only few exceptions for some industries. And it's an interesting question, why so late a minimum wage in Germany? And the answer is, 10 or 20 years ago, we had a really high coverage of union bargaining, of collective bargaining. And in such a system, you do not need a minimum wage. Like in the Scandinavian countries, where the coverage of collective bargaining is almost 100%, then you do not need an extra minimum wage. But we had over time this enormous decline in the trend of the coverage of collective bargaining, and especially also in the East, by the way. And I think the economy came to a point where there was still an urgent need of a wage floor. And this was introduced in 2015 after, I think, heavy discussions between economists, or also within, of course, within the different political parties. But the Grand Coalition made it to one of their key points for the current period, and so it was introduced. And I think in the end it is a success, although many people were very skeptical, and especially economists were skeptical before the introduction, but it turned out that the fears of huge employment losses did not realize. A further aspect of the German system is that many people top up their earnings by public subsidies in order to get earnings that are needed to fill the basic needs. And more than 1.3 million people are behaving this way, and the idea of the minimum wage was also to reduce the number of people that are forced to top up their incomes. But the expectations were too positive in this respect. The minimum wage did not succeed really in reducing the number of these workers substantially. And we know the reason why that's the case, because many of these people, we call it the Aufstocker, they work only few hours, and even if they get the minimum wage, it is not sufficient to get a level that fills the basic needs. So they are still dependent on public subsidies. So only roughly 60,000, 40 to 60,000 of people that are now earning so much that they are not depending on the system any longer. So this, for some people, this was bad news. They thought they're more optimistic in this case, but as labor market researchers, we knew that already before that this would not be a substantial effect. And what's a final point that's really interesting, we can see it very clearly in the data. In the German system, we have this so-called mini-jobs that are jobs with only typically few hours a week and with a limit of earnings that can be earned by the workers. Today it's 450 euros. And these sort of jobs were substantially declining after the introduction of the minimum wage. We can see it in the data, it's very clear. The effect is very clear. And what happened is that the firms transformed these mini-jobs into, say, normal employment, eligible to social contributions. And I think this is a very favorable effect because mini-jobs they do not pay regular social contributions. They only pay a lump sum tax, or the employers pay lump sum tax, but there are no normal contributions to the social security system. And of course, we're interested in having a lot of the workers paying for the social contribution system. And I think that's one very positive effect of the minimum wage.
What do we know about the current impacts of the minimum wage on the German economy? Is there anything we can say at this stage?
We have some negative effects in Eastern Germany, but in general, the effects are relative to the total amount of the workforce are really minor. It was expected that if there are negative effects, then it would be in East Germany because wages in East Germany are roughly 20–25% lower than in Germany. And some regions, especially in the rural regions of East Germany, the level of pay is really very low. And so the bite of the minimum wage in this region was much higher than, say, a region like Munich or Hamburg, where you have really much higher wages in the average. Our first estimates for the size of the effect are in the order of magnitude of 60,000 jobs. This sounds a lot, but if you compare that with another number, 600,000 of jobs were newly created year by year in the last years. So that's tenfold the size of what was perhaps lost by the minimum wage.
At the moment, the German economy is doing very well. Do you expect the minimum wage to have a more negative impact on employment in the case of a recession?
Some colleagues have this expectation. I do not have. I have another opinion. What are my reasons? I think that the next recession is very likely caused by an external shock hitting the export industries. We know that the export industries, manufacturing industries, for example, they pay really high wages, and the minimum wage is not a point for them. They typically pay much higher wages. So for cushioning the shock, a reduction in the minimum wage does not play a crucial role, in my view. So the minimum wage is paid typically in low qualified services like hotels and restaurants, for example. And I think these part of the economy are relatively robust against the business cycle. And so I do not think that this will be a really major point for the next recession. I think that a recession is typically ended by if aggregate demand recovers and not by reduction in wages. I do not believe in this mechanism.
A last question I have on this topic of the German minimum wage is, how big a role has it played in stimulating domestic demand, do you think?
There might be some effects in some sectors of the economy. In general, we can see the positive wage effects for the people affected by the minimum wage, and as I said before, there were no disemployment effect, so that there is a positive effect on the wage bill in general, in the aggregate wage bill. And I think this typically is valid for people that are belonging to lower income groups. And for example, if someone gets higher earnings and this person is able to go out for restaurant once more a month or so, then of course it is a positive impulse for the hotel and restaurant sector. And what we really see is that sectors that are heavily affected by the minimum wage, they're profiting from this demand effect. For example, the hotel and restaurant sector, which is really booming, and it's expanding the employment. So to some extent, perhaps they are suffering from higher costs, but on the other hand, they are favored by higher demand, and this is a countervailing effect.